Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. This is Matt Gayer, Executive Director at Spur Local. Apologies for being a couple minutes late there, running from a lunch and learn we were also running today. Busy time of year. But thank you all for being here, being patient, and we'll go ahead and dive on in. A couple things to note before we begin here. You should be able to see our slides right now, hear our audio. If you have issues with either of those, just let us know. We'll try to address those as quickly as we can today. If you have any questions throughout today, I know a lot of times folks have some specific questions about data or kind of a type of data they might be sharing, feel free to put those in the chat or the question box. We'll answer those as they come up today. We will send out the slides and recording shortly afterwards, along with an evaluation, less than a minute long to fill out. Really appreciate you all taking the time to do that. We do review that regularly. It's really helpful to us, and you'll have those slides and recording afterwards. So with that, we'll go ahead and dive on in. Plenty to talk about today. So when we talk about communicating data, I want to stay on this title slide for a second and just mention something that I was reading this weekend that's very relevant to this conversation. If you didn't see in the New York Times, there was an op-ed about generosity and what's called effective altruism, right? And if you boil down the article, it was basically talking about how this move towards tying personal giving and philanthropy to only efforts that can really be proven by data is taking something away from generosity. And people should move back towards just giving to their local, their words, charities in their neighborhood, out of the goodness of their heart, basically, right? As a very short summation of it. And it was really interesting to read that, and knowing we're going to talk about communicating data today, because parts of it I think are relevant, right? If folks are only looking at number of people served and they're looking at someone national serving 10,000 people compared to some of our partners that may only be serving 50 or 100, fair point. If you're only looking at those numbers and data, you're going to miss a lot of great organizations that we know that are out there. But I also didn't really love that they separated small nonprofits from having good data, because we know many of our partners have really great information about their work, really great information about what's happening. It's not just those giant organizations out there that, yes, they might have more data, more analysis, et cetera, but we have plenty of ways that we can tell our story and tell our story confidently. So if you haven't read it, it's an interesting read that kind of gets at the heart of this issue. And our perspective is definitely that we hope donors and foundations are not solely looking at numbers when giving, but that also small nonprofits have numbers to give and numbers to share. And it's about sharing that information effectively, and it's really what we'll dive in here today too. So with that as kind of a prologue, we'll get in here to some specific tips and tricks for sharing information. So one reason why this is so important, and again, we'll talk about some specific ways to do this here in just a second, because I know it's what folks are probably most interested in learning about, but communicating about why this is so important is that roughly these days, somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2, depending on the survey you look at, of folks in the general public have some level of distrust of nonprofits, right? So again, in the Chronicle of Philanthropy recently, in a survey about 1/3 distrust how nonprofits use their money. In other surveys we've seen in recent years, that's up as high as 50%. Regardless, it's too many people, right? We know that is kind of an unfair kind of lens given to the sector. For some reason, the example we always give there is that if you go to a restaurant and get food poisoning, you don't stop eating at all restaurants. But if one nonprofit is in the news for doing something, not aligned, not mission aligned with their funding, people apply that to all nonprofits in the sector, right? We also see, and not to get too much in the trust issue here, but why is this happening is just as trust in government and public sector has eroded, that has bled over to the nonprofit sector as well. No fault of ours, usually definitely no fault of small community-based organizations, but it's a reality we have, right? So if we're going out to the community with a fundraising pitch, we have to know that this is there, and that we have to be able to address this issue of trust when we're communicating with folks that don't yet know us. So we want to think about how we can be transparent with our data and with our finances. This often means just linking to, for instance, our last $9.90 on our website somewhere, right? We don't have to put it front and center. It doesn't need to be a big thing, but putting it somewhere on our website allows us that when someone says, hey, I didn't see your finances, you can say, well, actually, it was on the bottom of our about page, or was on our X, Y, or Z page. Analysis, right? We'll talk a little bit more about this here in a second, but making sure we're thinking about how do we go deeper than just we work with 100 students a year, right? How do we get to that impact? How do we get to that outcome? That's really what kind of starts building trust with audiences, is that we have those kind of results-based data as well. And we won't have results for everything. A lot of us do work that's really hard to measure. A lot of us do work that's really costly to measure, so we may not have every piece of data, but having some is really usually in most cases enough to build that trust. And then finally, we'll talk about dissemination, right? How to get the info out. That's one thing we'll talk about, but another thing we see that really helps with that kind of trust gap. So knowing this, knowing that folks are looking for data, that's been a trend in philanthropy for well over a decade, knowing that there is this trust issue, how are we actually getting information out the door in a way that's going to impact folks? That's what we're going to dive into here. So the first is that we really want, what data you should share, right? There's no kind of cut and dry answer to that. It's going to depend on a lot of things. It's going to depend on who you are, what type of organization you are, what social issue you work with. But a lot of this is going to depend on who your supporters are, right? If your donor audience is a younger professional audience, they're going to be asking a lot of questions, right? They are pretty familiar with systems a lot of times. And they're thinking really critically about your work, whereas we may have a donor audience that's a little less community involved, right? Maybe they're a little less kind of coming at this from kind of a professional lens. And they might be more just kind of interested in the stories you have, right? And we're going to all have at least some donors that are on both sides of that spectrum of all stats, all stories. But where you fall on that kind of mix is going to impact the type of data that you're sharing. So the first thing there, consider your audience, right? Really thinking about who your audience is. What do we think they're expecting of us? And how can we kind of meet that expectation in a way that's sustainable for us? Secondly, and I mentioned this earlier, but not all data is created equal. There's data that's about the scope, which is really about the size of our program, which is helpful to know, right? Especially if there's growth, is helpful to be able to communicate. But really what people usually are most interested in is, what are your programs actually doing, right? What's the impact? Now that might be an output, right? Just kind of a quick, we provided 1,000 hours of in-classroom education this year, right? That's a little more telling of what you did than just we served 50 students, because now I know how much you serve those students. Ideally, we then go one level deeper to actual impact, which is, and we saw the students that participated increase their reading levels by 1.5 grade levels by the end of the year, right? Or 80% pass their end of year test, right? Whatever that might be. But starting to get closer to that impact, at the very least getting to that output, not just living with that scope and that size of the program. At times, depending on the organization type of work, it might be helpful to bring finances into this, right? And talk about, especially for some of our groups that work with a small number of people. We have one organization that works with adults with developmental differences. They only work with about 12 or 15 folks a year, right? So on pure number of people served, they're not going to win a lot of decisions, right, on who folks are going to donate to. So why they only serve those many people, though, is because they work with them in a really high-touch way, right? They work with folks that no other service locally is going to serve, that they kind of require that nonprofit to be able to do that for them. So they talk about the cost, right, of helping kind of even one person in their network, which helps answer that question of why aren't you working with 50, 100, 500 people, and helps often kind of engage and drive donors in that way. Sometimes it can be helpful to make sure that, if you're joining the webinar and you're like, I don't know what data to share, feel free to put that in the chat. We'll try to help with that. But also looking at peer organizations or even larger national organizations or regional organizations that are doing what you do on the ground locally and seeing what they're sharing, right? If you're working in the environmental space, looking at what those national and regional environmental groups are sharing and being able to share similar stats or sharing different types of stats because you're not going to compete on that pure number-based level, right? So thinking about what do I want to borrow kind of in direction on the stats I'm sharing and what do I want to try to be unique on. And then finally, it's a really important thing to remember that one, data includes qualitative data, which are stories, right? So when we talk about our data strategy and data communication, we need to be thinking about storytelling as well. And two, we need both stories and stats. We know some organizations kind of run with the story part, have very few stats. Others are very stat heavy, right? Their donor pitch looks like an Excel sheet. There's numbers all over it, but they lack those stories. We see really both are really critical. Tying that where we're saying, we serve 100 students, 87% passed their reading test within the year. Here's what that meant to Josh, right? So setting up that stat, setting up that scope, and then telling that story, or flipping that, telling the story of Josh and saying he's one of our 100 students who improved their reading score by 87%, right? So thinking about how we balance those can be really important. The other thing I'll say there with that is that, this is an old stat, so we need to find an updated number for it, but the core of it stays true, is that if you take roughly 10 donors in the US and you give them a pitch that's mainly stat focused or mainly kind of story focused, about 6 of those 10 are going to be most motivated to give to you because of a statistic, right? These are folks that are scrolling on Instagram, see a stat that you posted, think it seems impactful, right, and donate $25-$50, right? So 6 out of 10 folks donate because of a stat or because some type of proof point that your work makes a difference. 3 of those 10 donate because of a story, right, an emotional connection to the work you're doing, and those 3 donate collectively more than the 6, right? So when we look at major donors, typically at least part of why they're giving is an emotional connection to the work. So if we're only sharing stats and not sharing kind of that qualitative context here, why these stats matter, why did it matter the student passed their test, why did it matter this person got a permanent house, why did it matter X, Y, or Z thing that we did, we're missing that connection with the heart, right? That we know helps contextualize some of the stats and some of the kind of logical connection we're making to our donors. The next thing we want to talk about in terms of communication is that a lot of times, a lot of this conversation ends up being about writing, right? How do I include this in an email? Should I include a stat or a percentage, right, et cetera? Want to talk a little bit about visualization because a lot of communication happens visually, right? The majority of ways we kind of make first impressions with organizations, first impressions as a brand with our audience is the visual element of it. So we need to think about that visual element when it comes to our data. So this could be anything from kind of a chart, diagram, graphic, graph to a picture, right? That's created as some type of way to visually represent the information. We'll talk about a couple examples here in a second. Why this matters, why this can be helpful. People are much more likely to remember something that they see than that they read. For the majority of people, not everyone, but the majority of people, if they see a stat, even if it's just 87% on a big graphic, right, that you make in Canva versus just typing 87% in an email, much more likely to remember that if they're seeing that as a graphic. So if I have 1 or 2 stats I want to drive home, at the very least, just putting them on a bright colored background on Canva that's within our branding and throwing that as an image in the email, throwing that on social media, it's going to get more people to remember it than just writing it or even just saying it. Secondly, it helps people interpret information faster, right? If I write a couple sentences with 4 or 5 stats in it, folks usually have to read that once or twice to really understand what I'm saying. Instead, I can probably make a graphic, a flow chart, right? A picture that really illustrates this a lot faster, and folks can typically process it faster and get to what do I do with this information instead of what is this information. And then finally, we see more interaction, right? Especially on social media, but even on email, right, or even in kind of printed materials, folks usually interact more, either ask questions, are more likely to share it with other people, more likely to do something to support or related to the action and information we're sharing if it's visual, right? So they're more likely to click that donate link. They're more likely to forward the email to a friend. They're more likely to like our post on social media if there's a visual representation of the data than if it's just written down. So diving into just one example of data visualization, right? The stat they have here isn't even necessarily about their impact, it's about the problem, right? So they're trying to highlight why their work matters, right? What are they up against here? So it's not always that we're visualizing data about the work we do. It could be visualizing data about the need we're trying to address or the opportunity we're trying to meet. So in this case, it's an environmental organization. They're trying to highlight this is an old stat, so sadly it's probably more now, but 1.4 billion pounds of trash entering the ocean every year, right? They could have just written that down, right? Or even if it's a graphic, they could have just put that stat on a blue background and use that as an image. But instead, they did a couple things here that are easy, that are subtle, but are actually really effective in terms of engaging their audience, right? So instead of just mentioning the ocean, they put a picture of the ocean in the background, right? Now you as the audience are thinking about the last time you were at the beach, right? You're thinking about that upcoming summer vacation. You're thinking about personalizing it, right? It feels more personal to you. Not just saying trash, but putting that trash can, right? I have a trash can at home. I use a trash can regularly. There's a trash can in my office. Again, it personalizes it for me. It makes me feel more connected to it. So now I'm engaging emotionally with it, not just intellectually with it. I may not be aware I'm doing all those things, but those are why they're on there. A couple of the things at the bottom here, right? The skull and crossbones, the plastic water bottle. It's both highlighting how bad and dangerous this is, but also how I might be contributing to this when I throw that plastic water bottle on the ground, right? When I leave it at the beach, etc. So thinking about how we can use infographics to really kind of engage people in a stat that isn't just a number, and it's telling a lot of story without having to take up a lot of real estate or a lot of time, right? Second thing we don't have an example of here, but there's plenty out there, is timelines. So a lot of times, especially if you're communicating to an audience who doesn't know you well, you're trying to communicate kind of your impact over since your founding, or how you impact a client across a year. This is one of my favorite examples of how folks use this. So you can use this if you're trying to communicate the history of your organization, put a timeline up there, right? A couple different spots on the way, especially if you've been around for a long time, right? Some of our partners, 20, 40, 50 years. That can be really helpful to sum up how you got to where you are. The other way people use this, though, is about, here's how I support a student from January to December. Or sometimes even better yet, here's how I work with one of my clients on a typical Tuesday, right? And walking them through that kind of timeline, right? 7 a.m., we're setting up the space. 8 a.m., people arrive for, breakfast. 10 a.m., we have a group therapy class. Noon, we have an exercise class, whatever that might be. But walking people through the day a little bit pulls back that curtain on what you're actually doing every day. It sizes it in a way that folks can feel like they understand it. And while that may or may not feel like data, that is data you're sharing, right? You're sharing out data of like, hey, we have typically 20 people come join us for breakfast every Tuesday morning. And we host a community exercise class for 45 people every day at noon. And, we're doing these different things there. I won't go into this example as much. I will say the fundraising campaign itself had some pros and cons to it, but just as a visualization, they took what could be easily just a bar chart, right? A bar graph that we might be familiar with from middle school back in the day, and made it a lot more engaging, right? So the fundraising campaign, right, was about these kind of ice buckets, et cetera. By putting those different stats about where the money was going in there on an ice bucket versus on a graph, again, emotionally engaging, landing that with something they're familiar with instead of just making it feel like a graph I'm looking at. And finally, for some of our hyper-local organizations, maps can be a friend here to show kind of where you're working or where the need is that you're addressing. A couple of visualization tools we'll pull out. These days, Canva has really increased their suite of tools enough that it's pretty much the only one we can recommend out of here. But for some basic things you may need in other cases, if you have a lot of really deep data, you're doing some deeper analysis, you have a data background, RAW has some visualization tools for doing that deeper analysis. Flourish is a newer one that can be great for kind of building interactive maps or timelines, so those more unique charts that Canva may or may not have a template for. Google Charts, if you're doing some basic graphs, again, I would probably do that in Canva most time these days, but some folks prefer the interface there with Google Charts. And then not used as much, but Tableau Public is just another one that, again, you could look at, and if you prefer the interface, you can kind of prioritize that. Canva, I will say, Canva has really made a lot of investments over the last couple of years to help you find the template that can best help you. So if you're not using Canva now, highly, highly encourage it. I won't spend long here, but think about what color you're using in your data visualization you're doing. Seems like a very specific note to highlight, but depending on the type of data we're sharing, we want the color to match, right? The number one thing that drives emotion when people look at things visually is the color first, unless it's a picture. So if it's a graphic you're making, that color is going to tell folks, if it's red, this thing might be dangerous, right? Or a problem or a challenge. If it's yellow or orange or bright, it might be something that's good. If it's blue or darker colored or dark green, maybe it's something that's a little more serious, right? Or it could be kind of tied to my social issue, right? Green for the environment. So thinking about kind of what are other people doing in the space? Is there kind of a sector color that I should be leaning on? And what colors are going to cause what emotions? And I want to make sure all the colors I use here in my data visualization are on brand. That is one thing we see go wrong in data communication, is that we kind of throw out the brand guide and just pick colors kind of randomly. We want those colors we pick in those graphics to fit our typical brand. Thinking about that data visualization piece, making sure, again, it tells a story, like that kind of ocean trash can example, right? There's a story behind that, even if you didn't remember the stat on it. And it should feel like something that's coming from you in terms of visual branding. We want to take out extra stuff, right? All those examples we shared are pretty clean, pretty simple. The simpler, the cleaner it is, the better. And we want to use, the context we're writing, the posts we're writing on social media, the language in the email to kind of give all the other context. We want the graphic to be very simple. And we want to think about whatever is most important for the audience to take away, putting at the top, right? So people read things top down, left, right, big, small. So if I want someone to really take something away, I want it to be big in the middle or left kind of top part of the graphic. A couple other kind of tips here, and then I'll pause for questions folks have in the last couple minutes. Want to make sure we're not overwhelming folks. So when communicating data, a lot of times, especially as a smaller organization, we might have a sense that we should really try to go out there and communicate as big as we can, right? We serve 70,000 meals, 100,000 meals a year, right? That's a good example of one of those times where sharing that, right? I serve 100,000 meals a year. 100,000 is a really big number. It's really hard for me as an individual to visualize 100,000 meals, right? I may or may not have seen 100,000 of something at the same time before. But if instead I'm communicating, we serve 3 hot meals a day, every day to this many people, right? Or this month we'll serve this number of meals, right? Or for this many days in a row, we've served 3 meals a day. As we start breaking it down, right, each student receives, 5 hot meals a week, right? That I can then start to imagine. I can start thinking about what I had for breakfast, what I had for lunch, what I had for dinner. It personalizes that data stat, makes it more likely for me to be engaged by it. So there's a time and place for those big numbers. Sometimes we want to do kind of the shock and awe in terms of the scope, but most of the time, most of the examples we see that are most effective are breaking those numbers down in a way that people can really be impacted personally by. The other thing we see here is trying to take some of the percentages we use, so not on like academic test scores, but saying like 80% of our clients have a full-time job within 12 months of graduating our program. That's great to say, but if instead we shift that to 8 out of 10, we actually see more engagement from audiences with that 8 out of 10, right? So doing a rate, not a stat. A statistic is not like a real thing, right? I have to do a little math. I have to think about, right, what 80% means. And even though I can do that quickly, even though that might feel natural to me, there is an intellectual process that has to happen there. If instead I say 8 out of 10, right, 8 out of 10 participants, now I'm thinking about 10 people. I'm thinking about 8 going on right for a job. And again, I'm more emotionally connected to it. So we do see data shows those rate stats are more effective at engaging folks than stats a lot of times, if it's going to be something like, number of participants. Keeping data simple, thinking about kind of building that logical order, those are other kind of tips for that visual piece there. So with that, I'll go ahead and pause for any questions that folks have before we wrap up here. Someone asked, how quickly should I be refreshing my data? So that's a great question. So, if it's on annual data, I think it's fine to share data from last year for basically the first half of the year, right? So when thinking about next year, you can share your 2024 stats all year long, but really, especially during kind of the first quarter of the year. As you get into that summertime, early fall, we're going to need to start having some data from your recent programs. This is similar to how we see donors are really motivated right now by recent stories because it indicates to them you're actually doing stuff now, right? So trying to drive home, if I had a medium engaging story from last month or a very engaging story from 6 months ago, I might lean towards the medium engaging from last month because the donors really have a recency bias right now. I think this is true with stats as well. That obviously you don't want to break it down so far that the stat doesn't mean much, but making sure that data is refreshed, making sure that at least the data is from kind of the last 3 or 6 months, so that donors feel like this isn't something you did a long time ago, but it's something that you're doing right now. Other questions folks have? I know we're right at time, but happy to stay on for another minute if folks have anything else. Someone's saying I do work that's harder to measure. Any kind of broad advice? So I think thinking about if you currently are attending this and feel like I don't have a lot of impact data, I don't have a lot of outcome data, or I haven't really thought about that before. I think I would say think about what your program goals are. Right? You probably do your program for a reason. You don't just do it to do it. So think about what that program goal is, and then think about how we might be able to measure it. Right? And that might be as simple as kind of a survey of participants, right, to kind of see how they feel after the program. Or it might be looking at some observational data, right, again, about how many of my alumni are now gainfully employed or attending college, or how many folks come back and participate in the program for a second year. And we're looking at that retention as kind of an impact stat, right? Folks want to stay involved. So I would start there with program goals if you don't feel like you're collecting data, and then thinking about how can I measure if those goals are being achieved. Those are probably what your donor audience cares about as well. All right, I see 2 other questions in the chat that we'll get to here. So someone's saying, how do we follow up once we come up with the questions after processing what you've shared? So 2 ways I could take this. So one, I'll say, in case you're saying, how do you follow up with our team to help? Feel free to email us. We're always happy to kind of think through some of this. But if you're thinking about how you kind of follow up with your donors after thinking about those questions and processing, I think a big thing is that sharing 1 or 2 stats at a time is helpful because that means you can share 1 or 2 more later, right? So it's important sometimes for your donors not to see the same questions all the time, but thinking about how we kind of vary those stats across a year, just like we vary our stories across a year. And finally, someone was asking about any tips on data communication for small nonprofits, any tips on data collection for small nonprofits. We do have a separate webinar on that. So if you reach out to our team, we're happy to share the recorded one because I don't have time to get into all of it. But I think the biggest thing I would say is if the data collection challenge you have, the one we hear most often from small nonprofits is that I have one person at most, right, doing fundraising. I have a couple people doing programming. They're super overworked. They don't have time, right, to capture a story or capture a stat. So thinking about, as the executive director of the fundraiser, how do I make it as easy as possible for my possibly part-time, possibly off-site program staff to capture some of this information, right? And sometimes that's leaning on technology, making a standing survey that they can quickly input a story. Sometimes it's leaning away from technology and maybe a paper survey they hand out to people at the end of the program that they can check off real fast and that you can collect from them and you do the data collection and kind of inputting and analysis. Maybe that's easier, right? So I think sometimes we run too fast at assuming tech can solve this for us, but there are ways tech can be really helpful for this. The other data collection I think see as a challenge for small nonprofits is just where do I store it? There are a lot of cool options for that eventually, but initially Microsoft Excel is your friend, right? Keeping that in a database, keeping that in a Google Sheet if you use an online document instead, and just trying to set a pace for I'm going to update or check on my data every 2 months, every 3 months, right? If I don't have time to do it more often. and focusing on how I collect it moving forward, not trying to clean up data in the past. That's a great rainy day project, but most of us don't have many slow rainy days to do that. So just trying to do it correctly kind of moving forward. With that, I know we're over time. Don't want to keep folks too long there. So we'll send out slides and recording shortly afterwards. Thank you all for joining. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Have a good rest of the day.